morning. So today we're going to be continuing in our series called The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of David. And today we're going to be talking about the fall of Saul. There are two things in American Christian culture that continually get in the way of us finding the will of God. And this may shock some of you. We may not even want to acknowledge this reality, but it's the powerful influence of our head and our heart. Most of the time, our head and our hearts, they can come into some kind of an agreement. But there are times when they don't. In such times, which is right? Which do you follow? Some say follow your heart. Some say do what seems best to you. You know, you do you. We love that saying, don't we? But haven't we all done what seems best and found ourselves in the trouble of a lifetime? Equally, haven't we all had times where we followed our heart right into our biggest disappointment? Our heart and our instincts, they aren't always right. Our primal drives, our emotions, our passions, they can get us into some very serious trouble. I mean, our mind can play tricks on us. Sometimes we get things backwards or scrambled or confused or just mixed up. The point is, both equally have the potential to lead us astray, even when they agree. When we allow our heart and our mind to lead us, even here, even the best of us will eventually fall. Why? Because our mind can justify just about anything we want. Our life is full of examples of times where we rationalized ourselves into all kinds of trouble. Proverbs 14:12 says, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death." I mean, think about it. We have at one time easily convinced ourselves to do every bad thing we've ever done. We've talked ourselves into some of the dumbest things we've ever done. But our heart is no angel either. It'll lead us astray just the same. So many follow the advice, follow your heart. Sounds good, doesn't it? What does your heart tell you? What do you want most? Anyone's heart ever gotten them into some serious trouble? Our heart is exceedingly wicked. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" You need to see these statements. Do what seems right to you. You do you. Follow your heart. All of these things can and have led us to happiness, but haven't they also led us astray? Sometimes you get it right. You roll the dice, and sometimes you get it wrong. So what are we to do? Who doesn't want to always get it right? How do we keep ourselves from falling off the right path? Since Christ established his church, God gave every believer something that will lead us to the truth, to life, if we'll just follow it. He keeps us on the right path. He even helps us discern when to go, this way, that way, the right way, but when our head and our heart would have us go another way. John 16:13 says, "But when he, the Spirit of the truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come." He will lead us, but he can only lead if we follow, if we willfully surrender to his leading. Some things are spiritually discerned. In other words, our head and our heart, they won't get it. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, "The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit." As the Apostle Paul said, there are some things, sometimes, some moments of decision that our head and our heart, they'll argue, even with the Spirit of God. There are places God desires to take each one of us that our head and our heart can't take us to. As believers, when we give, and I mean like really surrender our head and our heart to God, to the leading of God, he will reveal his path, and we need to be prepared for those times when it will defy our own head and heart. And it's paramount that we surrender to him, especially in those times when our head and our heart would argue. He will lead us, and he'll keep us from slipping, from stumbling and falling those huge falls. 1 Samuel 10:6, "The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you." So King Saul was given this Holy Spirit to help him. And some of the biggest disasters in his life came when he followed his head and his heart over the leading of the Spirit of God. Because King Saul had a huge fall. Because when it came time to choose head, heart, or Holy Spirit, he chose wrong.
I wore the wrong socks. Have you tried the hot dogs here?
He's like, so you get to go home for the rest of the day.
He's not going to be much use to us, I don't think.
Needless to say, I didn't get my deposit back. Needless to say, I didn't get my deposit back. And Viper Mitsubishi is a proud sponsor of Golden Gopher Hockey.
Yeah, I think he's done. There are different kinds of tripping. Don't you hate it when you trip on something that isn't there? It doesn't take much for any of us to trip, right? You know, we even trip ourselves, and we don't need any help from anyone to fall down. We can do that just fine all by ourselves. Thank you very much, right? I don't know what's more embarrassing, to trip on what isn't there or to trip on what is. But we all stumble in many ways. But wouldn't it be nice if you could know where the slippery spots are, you know, to keep us from stumbling? Wouldn't it be great if the Holy Spirit put signs up that says, you know, don't go that way. If you go that way, be careful, you know. And that way over there, I would just stay away from that way altogether, right? King Saul starts out well. He does, but his life ends in nothing short of a train wreck. We often talk about and learn about his mistakes, but what's missed, I think, is the potential and the promise that existed in Saul. But it was never realized because in the end, he tripped himself. He's an uncomfortable warning of what can happen to us. We need to be desperately careful of what we think about and what we long for. Because when we dwell on evil, it won't be long that we partake in that destructive behavior. Not every thought or passion or desire we may have is good. It's in our nature to pervert and to distort and to compromise. It's much easier to wander than it is to stay on the path. Some of our thoughts and desires can be dangerous. And left in the unchallenged echo chamber of our heart, you'll find that you end up doing the very things that you shouldn't do. And what we learn from Saul is that potential that exists in all of us. We can all fall. It's not as hard as you might think. The hardest part about Saul is, like I said, starting out, he's a pretty good guy. He was humble even. You know, what happened to that humble man can happen to all of us. His transition from being humble to being a monster, it was incredibly quick. The same things that brought Saul down can bring any one of us down. From 1 Samuel 9:21 to 1 Samuel 10:15, Saul doesn't even brag to his family about his new high position. And then in 1 Samuel 10:21, the day of his inauguration, he's hiding in the supplies cart. And then he still, after that, goes and he works in his father's field. And that's where the Spirit of the Lord comes powerfully upon Saul. But in no time, he goes from being humble into being a monster. In the end, he was a glory thief. He wanted the glory, the praise, the recognition, the admiration, the bragging rights, to be esteemed. The first thing we see in the fall of Saul is that Saul failed to wait for Samuel to come to Gilgal to offer the burnt sacrifice to God. 1 Samuel 13:5. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sands on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. And some of the Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. Most of the time, when we face a difficult decision, we follow what our head and our heart tells us to do. But are the things that our head and our heart, the things that they're telling us, are they always the right thing? What's your default? When you're in a tough spot, do you listen to your head, your heart, or do you look to God? This is one of those things that as Christians, we really don't like to talk about because it kind of makes us a little uncomfortable. It strikes way too close to home, meaning, when we're here, at D groups or youth group or small groups or men's groups or women's groups or at the worship service even. We say all the things that we're expected to say. We sing the songs like we're expected to sing. Most of us do anyway. We might even act a certain way, the way that a Christian should act. But are those things that you say or that you do, are they coming from your head and your heart? Are they something that would bring glory to God? Because there is a difference. Jim Carrey once said, so many of us choose our path out of fear, disguised as practicality. When we're in a situation like Saul's in right now, he's watching his men let their heads lead them in what seems like a logical decision. A practical decision, self-preservation. We got to get out of here. They're going to wipe us out. You see, the Philistine army was not only bigger, but they were more technologically advanced and they had better strategy than the Israelites. Not to mention, the Israelites, they had 2 weapons. 2. Saul and Jonathan were the only ones with weapons. Why? Like I said, the Philistines were much better at strategy. They only allowed the Israelites, they controlled that area of commerce. They only allowed the Israelites to have farming tools. But really, that's kind of been the way Israel has always done it. The battle has always been the Lord's when it comes to the Israelites. Israel never accomplished anything by their own ability. So Saul's army is now using their head, and they're out of there. And the ones that did stay, they're on the verge of leaving too. All because the man leading them wasn't following God. Rather than having a heart that chased God, Saul's heart had been conditioned to conform to the societal standards of the day. To make things worse, Samuel, who was supposed to show up to perform the traditional burnt offerings to the Lord, he doesn't come on time. Saul's now in a really tough spot, right? As a king, you don't want to be seen to panic, but that's exactly what Saul does. Everyone is looking to him for guidance, and Saul, instead of seeking God's will in this situation, he makes a decision with his head. And he says, okay, no Samuel, okay, that's fine, I got this. He says, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul immediately begins with his excuses. When I saw the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal. And I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. So that's really the first thing that we see, and it's a pretty big indicator of what's to come for Saul. This is really the beginning of the end. The second thing that we see Saul do is that he makes an impulsive decision to bind his soldiers by an oath. Now, what I need you to understand here is that to break an oath from the king, regardless of how stupid it is, It had severe consequences. So let's jump ahead to chapter 14 here. What we find here is that while Saul's army is scattered and they've hidden, Jonathan is still following God's leading. And he goes on the offensive. He attacks a Philistine outpost. Verse 6 says, Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul." So Jonathan here is at 20-1 odds, literally. If Jonathan had been thinking logically, then those are not good odds. But Jonathan knew that the Lord was with him. With God at the helm, Jonathan and his armor bearer began a rout of the Philistines. 2 guys and only 1 sword, and they sent an army described as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They send them running to the hills. And that's all it took was a little faith. And then all of a sudden, the Philistine army, they begin to fight themselves. Verse 15 says, "In panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook." It was a panic sent by God. Jonathan starts a rout of the Philistines. But Saul, he's sitting down in the shade somewhere eating pomegranates, and he notices that the Philistines are all running away. So he says, "Great, hey, go grab the ark of God. Come on, let's go, people. We got to get to the front. We got a fight to win." So he came down so he could say, "Look at what I did." The men who left or hid back in chapter 13, they've returned to fight with the army now. You know, Saul's army now has the Philistines on the run. And Saul is quick to jump in and say, "Hey, follow me. And oh, by the way, cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. I want you to notice the wording of his oath there. "Before I have avenged myself on my enemies." As far as I'm concerned, that tells you all you need to know about Saul. Saul is all about Saul. Jonathan is leading the troops. He's at the front, so he doesn't hear Saul's oath. The Israelites are starving, and they're surrounded by food that could strengthen them. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan is basically like, that's stupid. And he seems rather unconcerned about the oath. He says, Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" Long story short, the Israelites have the Philistines on the run. Saul wants to pursue them, but now he's got a huge problem. His men are on the verge of passing out, so they start eating whatever the Philistines have left behind. In the process, they're actually sinning against God. It says they pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. So they're eating it raw. Someone brings this to Saul's attention, and now it's time to do some damage control for Saul. He tells the priest, then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, 'Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it.' So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there." So Saul has it in his mind at this point, let's pursue the Philistines and wipe them out tonight. But the priest says, hang on, we should ask God. Saul asks God, but he gets no response. Saul then is quick to blame his men, or maybe Jonathan did something. Eventually, they cast lots, and God reveals that Jonathan broke the oath. This is Saul's response. Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." And remember, this is his son he's talking about. Saul seems rather cavalier about the decision to kill his son. And the soldiers aren't having it. They're like, wait. But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. For he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Here's where we start to see that Saul, he had evil in his heart. And that's why God sought a man after his own heart. Now remember, in chapter 16 is where David comes into the picture. So God is preparing David to be the next king. Not at this moment, but a moment in the future. For now, Saul is still king. He's still the de facto leader of Israel. Saul's fall didn't begin when he acted in an evil way. It was when he came to long for what was evil. It was at this point Saul was really beginning to lose sight of the path that God had laid out before him. We cannot give ourselves a pass on our thought life. It's like that old Native American proverb. There's this old Cherokee teaching his grandson about life, and he says, there's a fight going on inside of me. And it's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One of them is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. He said the other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you and in every other person too. The grandson thought about this for a minute and he said, well, which wolf will win? The one you feed. The one you feed. Anything you dwell on long enough, you will eventually do. It's this hidden danger within all of us. We have to keep every thought captive. How many times have we said something or maybe done something following our head or our heart, sometimes repeatedly? We make up excuses to keep up appearances, to cover up what happened. A thought that led to another thought, and that got you thinking, and then your thinking led to planning. I mean, it's not like I'm actually going to do it, right? And then but what if? I'm just saying, what if I did this or that? We have this sort of back and forth conversation between our head and our heart, forgetting to ask for God's guidance in that situation. So slowly, we start justifying this idea or this thought until it becomes a reality. We must guard our hearts against evil. Saul was unable to do that, as we're going to see, was one of Saul's many character flaws. So the third thing that we see Saul do is in chapter 15. We see that partial obedience is the same thing as complete disobedience. Samuel again goes to Saul with instructions from God. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. So this is retaliation for something that happened back in the Exodus. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And I think Saul saw this as an opportunity to kind of redeem himself and maybe regain the kingdom that he knows is slipping from his grasp. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. But everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. In verse 11, God says this to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Remember, Samuel and Saul were close. Samuel goes in the morning to meet with Saul, and Saul just flat out lies to his face. He says, I have carried out the Lord's instructions. And Samuel at this point is like, you're joking, right? Why do I hear sheep? Why do I hear cattle? And Saul's like, oh yeah, that. So basically we figured that God didn't know how good the sheep and the cattle would be as a burnt offering. And Samuel says to Saul, he reminds him of his humble beginnings. He says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission to the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took the sheep and the cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied to him, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. We, like Saul, if we're not careful, can justify anything. Disobedience can be hidden behind things like sincere worship. You know, you might come in here to worship, but your real motivation is to make sure that so-and-so knows that, hey, that's not how we worship God here. You're doing it wrong. Or maybe it can be hidden behind, religious activities. We get involved in a class just so that we can hear the latest scoop and the latest gossip on so-and-so. Well, wow, that sounds really productive for the kingdom, doesn't it? It can also be hidden behind seemingly good motives. We volunteer around the church for nothing else but notoriety. Look at what Dave did. Wow, he's so great. Wow, thank you so much, Dave, for being such a humble servant. Let me tell you something. If you do anything around here with that mindset, then you are walking dangerously close to the footsteps of Saul. The final way that we see Saul is his fall is through his insane jealousy toward David. So what we see starting in chapter 18 is that Saul is becoming extremely jealous of David. He even tries to kill David himself several times. Chapter 18 says Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall, but David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns, and everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. So Saul's basically continuing to send David on these suicide missions with very little men. David comes back each time with even more notoriety. Notice in verse 14, though, it says, God is with David, and he is met with tremendous success in everything he does. Saul even tries to get Jonathan to kill David. But Jonathan won't do it. Instead, makes a covenant with him. He instead warns David, and David flees and is on the run. In the end, Saul lost complete access to God. In chapter 28, we see Saul has once again, he's been cornered by the Philistines. God is done with Saul. He won't answer him. Saul then goes to see essentially a witch, a fortune teller, and not the ones you see with the neon signs in their windows that says palm reading here, and they're doing it out of some closet in their house. I'm talking about a real one. Samuel at this point has died, and this lady is able to conjure up Samuel to talk to Saul one last time. 1 Samuel 28:15. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." As a king, with no one to challenge his thought life, no one to hold him accountable, Saul spiraled out of control until it finally killed him. No accountability will lead to judgment you don't want. What a trooper. We've all been there. And we'll be there again in a couple months. I wanted to end on a light note this morning because this can kind of conjure up some pretty raw emotions in all of us. Like I said, we all stumble in many ways. But wouldn't it be nice if you could know where the slippery spots are to keep us from stumbling? There is a way. Proverbs 3:6. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. God is asking you today, will you humbly submit to him? If you're here today,